Students, here's another lesson that really changed my life when I learnt about it. It's the story of John Newton, the horrible man who shook the world with his change of heart. Now, I don't know if you know anything about slavery, but this is something that was quite common for centuries and centuries and even thousands of years ago, where people would be bought and sold like property. A slave would never get any money, they would just have to work for an owner. But this story of John Newton is intricately woven with the story of the slaves. But let's start with his story. John Newton was born in Wapping, London in 1725. Now, this is what Wapping looks like today. You can see that it's a little bit upmarket and it's really posh, but I want you to imagine this area with a dirt road. It's muddy, it's rainy England. People are screaming at each other. They are throwing buckets of waste. Yes, they had to go to the toilet in buckets. Out of the window into this dirty street. There are carts and horses crossing the road all the time in this mud and muck and all this filth that's thrown in there. This is quite a poor area in 1725. As people walk up and down, they had these beautiful dresses that they wore in the 1700s, and they would have platform shoes so that when they walked through the mud, their beautiful dresses would not get dirty. So it's in these streets that he's born. This is close to the wharf where his dad was actually a ship's captain. He was born, the family was very happy with their little boy, but when he was 7 years old, he lost his mother to tuberculosis or TB. This is a disease of the lungs where you start coughing and slowly you start losing your power and you actually drown in your own lungs. 7 years old, can you imagine that? He loses his mum and he has to deal with this. He was sent to live with his auntie, but his auntie had many kids of her own and she couldn't give him the attention that he really needed. Part of the story is his dad is absent. His dad is a ship's master. And what his dad does is he travels to the Mediterranean, to Greece and Spain, and he trades there and then he comes back. But he would be gone for 4 months to 6 months at a time on his journeys out and his journeys back. So his dad would only see him every now and then. And what happened is he started making friends with some of the troublemakers in the city. They would go around pickpocketing people and causing all kinds of trouble until eventually his dad said, "This is rubbish. You're going to come and work on the ship with me." So he would get onto the ship and he was very reluctant, remember, very rebellious. He's about 14, 15 years old when he goes on the ship with his dad, and his dad's very hard on him because he realizes that he needs to discipline this wild child of his. He doesn't enjoy being with his dad, and because they don't have much relationship, they get into a lot of conflict. But what he does is he starts saving all the money that he can possibly save. He decides that the moment he turns 17, he's going to escape. Then he's going to be his own man and he's going to do his own thing. So he saves up all his money for about 2-3 years, and then one day they get into the docks. He gets off with his bag and he says goodbye to his dad, and his dad doesn't realize that he's never going to return to the ship. Off he goes, and he thought, as a 17-year-old, I'm a real man. I'm going to buy myself a drink. So he goes into the pub and he says, "Yeah, I want a drink." And this friendly man comes over and offers to buy him a drink. He says, "Come on, I'll buy you a drink." And he buys him another free drink and another free drink and another free drink. And eventually he is absolutely hammered. He's so drunk that he can hardly see out of his eyes. The next moment, the doors burst open and a bunch of soldiers run into the pub and grab him. What he didn't know is that the Navy was actually looking for men to come and work on Navy ships. Now you can imagine those wooden ships would be easily sunk, and he didn't want to sink with it. So Nobody else wanted to. So they would go get guys drunk and then arrest them for drunkenness, put them on the ship, and force them to work for the Royal Navy for 2 years. They would get paid, but only at the end of the 2 years. So naturally, what he tries to do is he tries to get off the ship. And because he tries to get off the ship, he gets 12 lashes with a cat of nine tails. Now, cat of nine tails is basically 9 whips, and each of them has a little metal bit at the end, the same as what we had in the previous story. And they would lash him because he was talking back, because of his arrogance, but he couldn't really escape. If he escaped, they could execute him as someone who abandoned the navy, right? And that was actually treason, and you could be executed. So there he is, stuck again under a hard taskmaster. He spends 2 years working for the Royal Navy. Once he walks out, he swears at them, he takes his money, and he decides, I am going to make my fortune. He gets to a ship called the Pegasus. The money was made through slavery. On this ship, the Pegasus, they would go out, travel to Africa, to countries like Ghana and Nigeria, and then they would go into the interior of the country with some of the local tribesmen, and they would go and they would capture the people from their little villages. They would take them and they would bind them up, just as you can see in this picture that I'm pointing to, and they would march them back to these slave castles. In the slave castles, they would take them to a room like this, and there they would tie them all to these shackles, and they would fit maybe 100 people in a small little room. Once the ships arrived, they would take all the slaves and they would load them underneath. Now remember, these are people captured in their villages. They don't want to go. They are being sold as goods. They are not seen as people. This picture down here shows how they loaded people into the ships. Now, to load more people, they would lay them down flat. There would be 3 different layers in the ship, as you can see here, and sometimes the guys would be greedy and they would want to make more money. So what they would do is put one on their side, one on their back, one on their side, one on their back. Now there are 3 layers of that. Nobody is getting up to go to the toilet. Can you imagine the guys that lie on the lower levels? If they've got to go to the toilet, that all soaks through and falls on the people at the bottom. Obviously diseases would be all over them, but they're trying to keep them awake and keep them alive, because that is the way that they would make money on the other side. They would then have someone that would crawl over these people to go and feed them a type of rice porridge, and they would also drag the dead ones out. Now, John Newton, being an arrogant person who just wants to make lots of money, gets into a lot of trouble because Princess Peye is an African princess married to the ship's captain. But he talks down to her, biggest mistake, because the ship's captain gets really annoyed because his wife is in his ear all the time about this guy that annoys her. He ends up becoming the slave of the slaves. He was the one crawling over them, giving them food in that filth, dragging the dead ones out and throwing them overboard. Sometimes they say that the slavers, if everybody got really sick, would rather see people still alive and shackled and drown them all so that they could claim the insurance money. What incredible cruelty. Now, John Newton, because he's in this difficult situation, because he's become the slave of the slaves, what they would do at night is they would go and they would tie him up to the mast of the ship, and he would sit there so that he couldn't escape, and Princess Peye would walk past and she'd laugh at him. So this young man who tried to do all the wrong things to make his fortune is now stuck, tied to the mast of a slave ship, going up and down over the Atlantic, transporting slaves. One night, a massive storm broke out. It was so big that they couldn't actually pull the sails up quick enough, and it was destroying their ship. And he sat there, he was being washed from one side to the other side by the waves, and he saw three other men washed overboard. And he was still tied to the mast, and that's how he stayed on the ship. John Newton was terrified, half drowning, and suddenly he remembered his mum when he was 7 years old before she died, and she was on her knees praying. And he thought, what can I do? What can I do? And that's the one thing he thought, I can do. I can pray. He says, God, if you exist, I pray that if I survive this storm and you set me free, I will live for you. The storm subsided, and the next morning, when the sun rose, on the horizon they saw a beautiful white sail, and it came faster and faster towards them. And they thought, oh no, pirates, what are we going to do? When the ship came past them, there were armed men ready to board their ship. They quickly boarded the ship, but they weren't pirates. These were actually men sent by John Newton's father to come and rescue him. They cut him loose, they took him onto their ship, and they set off for England. Now, John Newton didn't forget this prayer that he prayed, and he started gradually changing because he started reading the Bible, he learned to read and write, and he felt called to start serving God. Now, he would grow and grow in his knowledge of God until eventually he became a pastor himself. He would preach to people about God, and he started feeling incredibly guilty about all the slaves that he sent to the New World. And he met another young man, and this man was William Wilberforce. That's him over here, and this is John Newton as an old man. Funky hairstyle, doesn't he have it? So John Newton and William Wilberforce, they started working together because both of them were Christians. They decided this thing called slavery needed to stop. He would go and preach in churches to get people to get behind them. William Wilberforce would fight inside Parliament against all the parliamentarians. Everyone thought he was stupid to do this, but he was lucky enough before his death to see the British Isles make slavery illegal. And the group of Christians that fought to fight against slavery were the ones that did so out of their conviction that God didn't want people to be slaves. Now, John Newton is also known as the man who wrote Amazing Grace. Now, what I want you to do is, after you've watched this video, I'm going to put this link in for you that you can click. And I want you to go and look at this video of Amazing Grace, read what it says, and think about this man who was so dirty and filthy and selfish, and how he imprisoned people, but then was set free by God, and it changed. This is the reason, if you know, Australia was settled in 1788, that Australia never really had slaves, because it was being outlawed in the British Empire, and that is why Australia has got some bad history with blackbirding, but these men had a profound influence on what happened in Australia. Thank you very much for listening, and get onto Connect, where you'll find the link to Amazing Grace. Please answer the questions on your Google Doc.